He offered the fugitive orc a feast from his meager stores. She looked at the food, then at him, and said, "We'll eat whatever you throw away." The rain came down in sheets, turning the world outside his windows into a grey, liquid blur. Elias didn't mind. The rain was good for the late-season cabbage, and it kept people away. People were complications. They had needs and wants and opinions that tangled up the simple, straight lines of his life. His life was the field, the fence, the fire, and the silence. It was a small life, but it was his, built on the foundations of a much larger one that had collapsed years ago. The silence in the small stone farmhouse was a constant companion, a heavy blanket he had long since learned to wear. It was a silence once filled with a low hum and a light laugh, but now it held only the rhythmic tick of the water clock and the whisper of the wind through the eaves. The wind was louder tonight, a keening howl that seemed to carry voices. He told himself it was just the storm playing tricks on an old man's ears. He was not yet old, not by the reckoning of years, but he felt it in his bones. A weariness that had settled deep after Lena was gone. The farm was his penance and his sanctuary, a place to work until his body ached too much for his mind to wander. He stirred the pot of rabbit stew on the hearth, the smell of thyme and root vegetables, a small, warm comfort against the cold seeping through the stone walls. It was more than enough for him. It always was. A sound cut through the storm's roar, sharp and wrong. Not the crack of a fallen branch, but the splintering of wood under force. His hand went to the iron poker by the fire, his body tensing. He lived on the edge of the human kingdoms, a last lonely outpost before the broken tusks, the jagged, inhospitable mountains the orcs called home. He had never had trouble, not in 10 years. The local lord considered his farm a useful buffer, and the orcs, it seemed, had no interest in his stony patch of land. Then came a thud against his door, heavy, a dead weight. It was not the knock of a lost traveller. It was the sound of a body hitting wood. Elias stood frozen, the poker clutched in his hand. Every instinct screamed at him to douse the lamp, to stay silent, to pretend the house was as empty as his heart. The wind howled, and for a moment he thought he might have imagined it. Then the sound came again, a scraping, dragging noise, followed by another heavy impact. He moved slowly, deliberately, placing the poker back in its stand. A weapon would only invite a fight, and he was no fighter. He was a farmer. His hands were made for the plough, not the sword. He slid the heavy iron bolt on the door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He took a breath, smelling the wet pine and cold mud of the storm, and pulled the door inward. She filled the entire frame, a giant silhouetted against the tumultuous grey sky. An orc. A female, taller than him by a head, with shoulders as broad as the door she leaned against. Rain plastered black hair to her green skin and ran in rivulets down the sharp planes of her face. A broken arrow shaft jutted from the meat of her shoulder, a dark, ugly thing. Her armor, a patchwork of iron plate and hardened leather, was dented and scored, smeared with mud and something darker that the rain couldn't wash away. Behind her, 2 other orc females huddled, smaller but no less formidable, their eyes wild and feral in the dim light from his lamp. The one in the doorway, the leader, he knew it instinctively, met his gaze. Her eyes were not wild. They were chips of obsidian, exhausted but unbroken, holding a fierce, intelligent light. Her lips, thin and pale, parted to reveal short, sharp tusks. She tried to speak, but only a harsh grunt came out. She swayed, one hand gripping the doorframe to hold herself up, and the wood groaned under the pressure. He should have slammed the door. He knew it. This was death walking into his home. Harbouring orcs was a hanging offence, and even if the Lord's men didn't find out, what would these 3 do to him once they recovered? He was one man, a farmer. They were warriors. But he looked at the raw, ragged wound in her shoulder, at the tremor of exhaustion running through her massive frame, at the sheer, stubborn pride that was the only thing keeping her on her feet. And he saw not a monster. He saw a creature at the very end of its strength. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was not a welcome, not an invitation. It was a simple, unthinking act of yielding. She stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for a trap. Then, with a lurch, she stumbled inside, collapsing onto the stone floor with a heavy crash of armor and weary flesh. Her 2 companions scrambled in after her, dragging a wounded leg between them, and shoved the heavy door shut against the storm. The bolt slid home with a sound like a prison gate closing. His prison. Or theirs. He wasn't sure. The 3 of them were a vortex of sudden, contained violence in the quiet stillness of his home. His silence was broken. The leader pushed herself up onto one elbow, her gaze sweeping the single room of the farmhouse. It took in the hearth, the simple wooden table, the narrow cot, the shelves of preserved vegetables. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, missed nothing. They finally came to rest on him. Why? The word was a rasp, torn from her throat. Elias didn't have an answer. He looked at the arrow shaft in her shoulder, then gestured toward the chest where he kept his meager medical supplies. Old linen bandages, a needle and gut for stitching, a jar of willow bark tonic for pain. Her eyes narrowed. Your price? He shook his head, a small, tired gesture. Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this. He didn't say it. He didn't say anything. Words were useless things here. He knelt, not too close, and pointed again at her wound. That needs to come out. One of her companions, a wiry orc with a jagged scar across one eye, hissed and placed a hand on the hilt of her knife. The leader held up a hand, stopping her. She studied Elias again, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. Then she gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. Permission. The next hour was a brutal, intimate ordeal. He had to cut the arrowhead out. He brought the lamp closer, his hands surprisingly steady as he worked. He cut away the leather and mail around the wound, his knife scraping against the metal. Her skin was cool to the touch and covered in a network of fine, swirling tattoos that vanished beneath her armor. Old scars crisscrossed the new ones, a testament to a life of violence he could barely imagine. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but he could feel the rigid tension in her muscles, see the tight clench of her jaw. Her companions watched his every move, their hands never straying from their weapons. The air was thick with the smell of wet leather, iron, and blood. When he finally pulled the barbed black iron head free, she let out a slow, controlled breath. He cleaned the wound as best he could, his farmer's knowledge of poultices and herbs serving him well. He stitched the ragged edges of the wound together with neat, practiced motions, the same way he would mend a torn green sack. He expected a snarl, a grunt of pain, any reaction at all. He received only her unnerving, watchful silence. When he was done, he stood and moved back to the hearth. The stew was still warm. He ladled a generous portion into his only good wooden bowl and set it on the floor near her. He did the same for the other two, using chipped earthenware mugs. They stared at the food as if it might be poison. The wiry one sniffed at it, her nose wrinkling. The leader, Gruna, he would later learn her name was, ignored the bowl he'd set before her. Her gaze drifted to the bucket by the hearth, the one filled with vegetable peelings and meat scraps for the chickens. She looked from the scraps to the steaming bowl of stew, and then to him. Her voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "We'll eat whatever you throw away." It wasn't a request, it was a statement, a test, a declaration of pride so fierce it would rather starve than accept a gift that might be pity. She was establishing the terms of their exchange. They were not beggars, they were survivors. Elias looked at her, at the defiant angle of her jaw, the exhaustion warring with an iron will in her eyes. He understood. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pity, respect. Without a word, he picked up her bowl of good, rich stew. He walked to the scrap bucket. He hesitated for only a second before tipping the entire contents in with the peelings and bones. He stirred it all together with a wooden spoon and then pushed the heavy bucket across the floor toward her. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of surprise, maybe something more, crossed her face before the hard mask slammed back into place. She reached into the bucket with her bare hand, pulled out a chunk of rabbit and potato coated in scraps, and began to eat. Her companions followed her lead. They ate everything, leaving the bucket scraped clean. And in the quiet of the farmhouse, with the storm still raging outside, a fragile, unspoken truce was forged over a bucket of scraps. The next few days fell into a strange, tense rhythm. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky of pale, watery blue. Elias worked his fields, his body moving through the familiar motions of his life, but his mind was constantly aware of the three alien presences in his home. They were a disturbance in the placid pool of his existence, a constant, low-grade threat that kept him on edge. The two companions, Hela and Zoga, were a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. On the second day, while he was mending a rotted section of fence, they emerged from the house. Hela, the wiry one with the scar, simply took the axe from the woodpile. Zoga, broader and quieter, picked up the heavy maul. Without a word exchanged, they began to work their way through his winter woodpile. The sound of their labor was a sharp, percussive counterpoint to the quiet birdsong. By midday, they had chopped and stacked more firewood than he could manage in a week. They worked with a relentless, focused energy that was both terrifying and impressive. The day after that, they turned their attention to the crumbling stone wall at the edge of his property. They hauled massive stones from the creek bed, rocks he would have needed a lever and a full day to move, and set them into place as if they were stacking pebbles. They didn't speak to him, didn't even look at him, but their actions were a clear, deliberate statement. They were repaying their debt. They were not parasites. Their leader, the tall one, spent most of her time inside, healing. He learned her name was Gruna when he heard Kella speak it in a low, respectful tone. Gruna was a quiet, brooding presence. She would sit by the fire for hours, sharpening a wicked-looking dagger or re-stitching the torn leather of her armor. Her movements were economical and precise, but mostly she watched. She watched him as he salted the last of the autumn pork. She watched him as he ground wheat into coarse flour. She watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes, assessing, measuring. He felt like a specimen under glass. He never asked who they were or what they were running from. Questions were dangerous. Questions invited answers, and answers created bonds. He didn't want bonds. He wanted them healed and gone. He wanted his silence back. Yet, a part of him, a small, treacherous part he refused to acknowledge, was intrigued. Her pride was like a mountain, immovable and vast. Her warrior's loyalty to her was absolute. They obeyed her slightest gesture, deferred to her in all things. She was clearly more than just a common soldier. One evening, exhaustion finally caught up with him. The strain of the extra mouths to feed, the constant vigilance, the disruption to his soul-deep routines had worn him down to a raw nerve. He had been up late, mending a broken harness by the low light of the fire, and had simply fallen asleep in his chair. He woke with a start, a sudden chill pulling him from a shallow, dreamless sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was cold. But a weight lay across his shoulders, something heavy and warm, and smelling of wood smoke and old leather. It was a cloak, a massive, fur-lined orc cloak. He sat up, the cloak pooling in his lap. Across the room, silhouetted by the pale moonlight filtering through the window, Gruna stood watch. She held his own wood-cutting axe in her hands, holding it not like a tool, but like a weapon she was born to wield. Her stance was relaxed but ready, her gaze fixed on the dark tree line beyond his fields. She had been watching over him. She had covered him while he slept. She must have heard him stir, but she didn't turn or acknowledge him. She just remained at her post, a silent, formidable guardian. The gesture was more profound than any words of thanks. It was an act of care, a reciprocation that went beyond simple labor. It was a shield offered in return for a sanctuary given. Elias pulled the heavy cloak tighter around his shoulders, the unfamiliar weight a strange comfort. He didn't go back to sleep. He just sat there in the dark, watching her watch the night, and the silence in the room felt different, less empty. The fragile thaw continued in the quiet moments that followed. They began to speak, not in long conversations, but in short, clipped exchanges by the fire. He found himself telling her about the farm, about the way the soil changed with the seasons, about the rhythms of planting and harvest. He spoke of Lena just once, his voice quiet and rough. He told her about the fever that had swept through the valley one winter, and how the silence she left behind was a physical thing, a weight he still carried. He didn't know why he told her. Perhaps it was because her own silence seemed to understand his. She listened, her head tilted, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. In return, she offered him fragments of her own life, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. She spoke of the burden of a name and the crushing weight of expectation. She mentioned a brotherhood forged in blood and broken by ambition. Her words were cryptic, veiled, but they painted a picture of betrayal and loss that resonated with his own quieter tragedy. She never named her enemies, never explained her rank or title. She was just Gruna, a warrior far from home. It was enough. One afternoon, while checking the snares he'd set along the creek, he saw it. It wasn't one of his own crude traps. It was an arrow, buried deep into the trunk of an old oak tree. It was unmistakably orc-made, long and heavy-shafted, but the fletching was wrong. Not the plain goose feathers the hunters in the mountains sometimes used. These were dyed black and a deep, angry red. And carved into the wooden shaft, just below the feathers, was a small, jagged symbol, a stylized tusk split down the middle. A cold dread settled in his stomach. This was not a stray shot from a hunting party. This was a message, a marker. He wrenched the arrow from the tree and carried it back to the farmhouse, his footsteps heavy. He walked in without a word and held it out. Gruna was cleaning her dagger. She looked up, saw the arrow, and her face hardened into a mask of granite. She took it from him, her fingers tracing the carved symbol. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound more animal than person. Forlag, she breathed, and the name was a curse. It was the first time she had given her pursuer a name. Kella and Zoga, who had been sparring in the yard, stopped instantly and came to her side. They saw the arrow, and the same grim, murderous look settled on their faces. They had been found. His quiet, isolated world was about to be torn apart. The attack came at dusk. They weren't expecting a full assault, not yet. This was a probe, a test. 5 of them, moving through the trees with a swaggering confidence that spoke of arrogance. They were large, brutal-looking males, armed with crude axes and iron-banded clubs. They likely expected to find a lone human farmer, an easy kill before they moved on to their real targets. They did not expect to find Gruna waiting for them. Panic seized Elias for a moment, a cold, paralyzing fear. He wanted to run, to hide in the root cellar and pray they went away. But then he looked at Gruna. She was calm, her eyes narrowed, her mind already working. She was a commander, and this was her battlefield. "The land," she said, her voice a low command. "You know it. Where is our advantage?" His fear receded, replaced by a surge of something else. Purpose. He wasn't a warrior, but this was his home. He knew every rock, every tree, every dip and rise in the earth. "The ravine," he said, his voice steady. "Behind the north field. It's deep. The game trail runs along the far edge. We can circle behind them." She gave him a sharp, approving nod. It was a look that said he was a useful tool, but also something more. A partner in this, however temporary. What followed was a terrifying, chaotic blur. He led them, running low through the overgrown ditches he dug for irrigation years ago. His practical knowledge of the land became a weapon. They moved with a deadly silence he could never hope to match, shadows flitting through the twilight. They circled around the scouting party, coming up behind them as they approached the farmhouse. The fight was short and savage. Gruner, Keela, and Zogga exploded from the shadows like furies unleashed. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Elias stayed back, his pitchfork held tight in his sweating hands, feeling utterly useless. He watched Gruner move, a whirlwind of controlled violence. She fought not with rage, but with a cold, deadly precision, her blade a blur of silver in the dying light. They left one alive, disarmed and bleeding on the ground. They dragged him back to the barn, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. Keller handled the interrogation. It was not pleasant. Elias stayed outside, the sounds from within the barn making his stomach churn. When Keller finally emerged, wiping her bloody knife on a rag, her face was grim. She spoke to Gruner in their harsh, guttural tongue. Elias couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. Gruner turned to him, her face silhouetted against the open barn door. "He told us everything," she said, her voice flat. "It is time you knew who you are sheltering." She was Gruner Bloodtusk, matron heir to the Ironfang clan, one of the most powerful orc clans in the Broken Tusk Mountains. Vorlag, the one who hunted her, was her foremost war chief, a celebrated warrior she had raised to power herself. He had betrayed her, staging a coup while she was away brokering a treaty with a rival clan. He had declared her weak, a traitor for seeking peace instead of war, and had poisoned the clan council against her. He had slaughtered her personal guard and now hunted her to eliminate the last threat to his illegitimate rule. The warriors with him were his personal host, the most fanatical of his followers. Elias listened, the crackle of the fire in the hearth the only sound in the room. Each word she spoke landed like a stone, building a wall between them. Matron heir, clan, war chief. These were words from another world, a world of politics and power and brutal ambition. He wasn't sheltering a fugitive warrior, he was hiding a queen. A cold, bitter anger began to smoulder in his gut. It was the old, familiar feeling of being small, of being a pawn in someone else's grand game. He looked at her, at this high-born leader, and the quiet connection he thought they had built felt like a lie. The shared vulnerability, the unspoken understanding. Had it all been a calculated manipulation? Had she seen him for what he was, a lonely, simple man, easily used? He felt like a fool. The trust he had tentatively offered felt cheapened, a tool she had used for her survival. He pulled back into himself, the easy silence that had grown between them now replaced by a chasm of status and deception. He gave clipped, monosyllabic answers to her questions. He avoided her gaze. He wanted her gone. He wanted his life back, his simple, empty, honest life. The horns sounded the next morning, a deep, mournful baying that rolled down from the hills and echoed across his valley. It was not the sound of a scouting party. It was the sound of an army. He went to the door and looked out. They were there, on the ridge overlooking his farm, a legion of them, a sea of black iron and grim, tusked faces. At their head was a massive orc in ornate, jagged plate armor, a banner bearing the symbol of the split tusk held aloft beside him. Vorlag. They surrounded the farm, a slow, deliberate encirclement. They were in no hurry. They were here to lay siege, to crush this last pocket of resistance and the insignificant human who had aided their quarry. The house he had built with Lena, the fields he had poured his sweat and sorrow into, the stone walls his father had raised. It was all about to become a battlefield. It was all going to burn. Vorlag strode forward, his voice a roar that carried easily across the field. Gruna Blood Tusk, you hide behind this human's pathetic hovel. Face your judgment, weakling. Your line ends here, in the dirt, where it belongs. The door opened, and Gruna stepped out into the pale morning light. She was not wearing the battered armor she'd arrived in. She was clad in the pieces she and her warriors had painstakingly repaired, gleaming and deadly. Her wounded shoulder was still stiff, but she stood tall, her presence seeming to dwarf the small farmhouse behind her. She ignored Vorlag's taunts completely. Her eyes scanned the field, and then they found him. Elias, standing in the doorway, his useless pitchfork held in his hands. She looked at him, and in her gaze he saw none of the deception he had feared. He saw desperation, yes, but also a fierce resolve, and something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat. Regret and respect. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp as a drawn blade. She spoke first in her own tongue, a string of harsh, powerful words directed at the armies arrayed before her. Kella and Zoga stood at her shoulders, their faces grimly proud. Then she turned her head slightly, her gaze still locked on Elias, and she switched to the common tongue so he and every orc on that field who knew it would understand. I claim this man, Elias of the quiet earth, she declared, her voice like iron breaking. The words stunned the field into silence. He is not my servant. He is not my thrall. He will be my mate. His strength is not in a blade, but in his roots, and his roots will be the foundation of my new clan. It was a political bomb thrown in the face of her enemy. It was a rejection of her culture's obsession with warrior strength. It was a defiant, insane public declaration. Vorlag stared, dumbfounded for a moment, before throwing his head back and letting out a great, booming laugh. It was a cruel, mocking sound. You would choose this grubber, this soft-handed human. You defile your bloodline. You are weaker than I thought." Elias was frozen, stunned into immobility. The anger and betrayal he had felt washed away, replaced by a terrifying, breathtaking clarity. She wasn't using him. She saw him. She saw the strength he didn't even recognize in himself. The patience, the endurance, the quiet resilience of a man who had lost everything and still got up every morning to tend the earth. In her world of brutal, fleeting power, his steadfastness was a strange and valuable treasure. He took a step forward, out of the shadow of the doorway and into the sunlight. He felt the eyes of 100 orc warriors on him. He felt small, soft, and utterly out of place. But he met Gruna's gaze. "I accept," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden hush. The words felt strange in his mouth, momentous and terrifying. He took another step, coming to stand not behind her, but beside her. "But I am a farmer. I am a human. I will stand with you, but I will not hide what I am." Her lips curved in the slightest hint of a smile, a fierce, proud expression that made his heart ache. "I would not have you be anything else." Forlag's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a snarl of pure fury. "Then you will die with him," he roared and raised his axe. The army surged forward. The battle was a nightmare of sound and fury. They fell back into the farmhouse, using its thick stone walls as a fortress. The windows became arrow slits, the door a deadly choke point. But it was a losing fight. They were 4 against 100. The heavy timbers of the roof began to splinter under the assault of thrown rocks. Smoke began to curl in through the barricaded windows. "We can't stay here," Gruna grunted, pulling an arrow from the wooden doorframe just inches from her head. "We have to break out, to the woods." Elias looked around the room, at the home that had been his entire world. He saw the chair where he'd slept, the hearth where he'd cooked 1,000 lonely meals, the faint scratches on the floor where Lena used to drag the heavy table for cleaning. All of it was about to be consumed. There was a moment of sharp, piercing grief. Then it was gone, burned away by the heat of the moment. That life was already over. "The barn," he said, his mind racing. "It's full of dry hay and the oil for the lamps." Gruna understood immediately. A diversion. While she and her warriors laid down a volley of covering fire from the front of the house, Elias slipped out the small back window into the herb garden. He ran low, keeping the stone wall between himself and the main force of the attack. Smoke stung his eyes. The sounds of battle were a deafening roar. He reached the barn, his lungs burning. He didn't hesitate. He threw open the doors, sloshed the lamp oil over the nearest pile of hay, and struck his flint. The flames caught with a hungry whoosh, racing up the dry tinder. Within seconds, the entire barn was an inferno, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. Shouts of alarm rose from the orc lines as the fire spread, a roaring, uncontrolled beast. He ran back to the house, the heat of the blaze at his back. "Now!" he yelled. They burst from the front door, running straight into the confused knot of warriors who had turned to face the fire. They cut a bloody path through the chaos. Elias stayed close to Gruna, his pitchfork a clumsy but surprisingly effective weapon for keeping attackers at a distance. He was not a warrior, but he was a desperate man with nothing left to lose. They reached the tree line, plunging into the cool green shadows of the forest. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see his home burn. He didn't want to see the ashes of his old life. He just kept his eyes forward, fixed on the broad armoured back of the orc woman who was now his future. They ran, leaving the smoke and ruin behind them, a new, uncertain path laid out before them. They travelled for weeks, moving through the treacherous terrain of the broken tusks. Gruna led them to a hidden sanctuary, an old, abandoned iron mine dug into the heart of a mountain. It was the designated rallying point for those loyal to her, a place of last resort. When they arrived, there were barely 24 orcs there, the remnants of her personal guard, old warriors who refused to bend the knee to Vorlag, and their families. They were a grim, desperate-looking band, and they did not like him. Elias was a constant target of their suspicion and scorn. To them, he was everything an orc was not. Small, tuskless, physically weak. They called him grubber and soft skin, their words dripping with contempt. They couldn't understand their leader's choice. They saw him as a liability, a pet, a bizarre indulgence that weakened her claim. Gruna's authority kept them from open hostility, but their prejudice was a cold, constant pressure. He ignored them. He did not try to win them over with words or boasts. He simply got to work. He saw that their water supply was a foul, stagnant pool deep in the mine. He spent a week single-handedly digging a channel from a clean underground spring he found, using his farmer's knowledge of irrigation to create a flow of fresh, clean water to the camp. The orcs watched him, their expressions grudging. He saw that their wounded were being treated with little more than dirty rags and crude magic. He spent days foraging on the mountainside, gathering the alpine herbs he recognized, yarrow to staunch bleeding, willow bark for pain, mosses that fought infection. His remedies were simple, practical, and they worked. More than one warrior who had scoffed at him found themselves seeking his help for a festering wound. Their smith was a surly, one-eyed orc who knew how to hammer iron, but not how to temper it properly. Their tools and weapons were brittle, prone to shattering. Elias, who had run his own small forge on the farm, showed him the secret of quenching the steel at the right moment, of folding it to create strength. He didn't command or instruct. He just worked alongside the smith, his quiet competence a lesson in itself. Slowly, painstakingly, he earned their respect, not with a blade, but with his hands, not with bravado, but with diligence. He was not a warrior. He was a builder, a healer, a grower. In this desperate community of exiled soldiers, his skills were more valuable than another strong sword arm. They began to see him not as Gruna's human pet, but as Elias the maker, Elias the healer, the foundation. Months passed. The ramshackle mining camp transformed under his and Gruna's combined leadership. The irrigation channels became defensive ditches. The mine shafts were reinforced and turned into secure living quarters. The desperate band of refugees became a small, thriving, and defensible settlement. Vorlag's forces still controlled the clan, but they were no longer hunted fugitives. They were a force in waiting. One evening, he stood with Gruna on a high ledge overlooking their new home. The smoke from a dozen small forges and cook fires curled up into the crisp mountain air. She was being fitted with a new cuirass, a breastplate of blackened steel they had forged together. It was a mix of orcish design, thick and formidable, and his own influence, with articulated plates that allowed for greater flexibility. He reached out, his calloused fingers checking the fit of the leather straps. It was a quiet, familiar motion, an echo of that first night when he had tended her wound. But the tension was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding intimacy. This was their new rhythm, their new life. A warrior queen and a farmer, preparing for war. She looked down at him, her dark eyes soft in the twilight. "The scout's report Forlag moves on the high pass," she said. It was a statement of fact, a sharing of information between equals. He nodded, his mind already working, picturing the terrain he had come to know as well as his own lost fields. The spring melt will have weakened the eastern approach. The ground will be soft there. It won't support his heavy siege engines. We can use that. She listened, her expression thoughtful, weighing his counsel. She was the blade, the sharp edge of their rebellion. But he was the stone she was honed against, the steady hand that gave her purpose. He had lost his home, his peace, his silence. But here, in the heart of a mountain, surrounded by warriors of a different species, he had found something he thought long dead. A purpose, a partner. He had been seen, and in being seen, he had found a strength he never knew he possessed. He fastened the final clasp over her heart, his hand resting there for a moment. It was where he belonged.